Most importantly, former Director of the Central Intelligence and Deputy Secretary of Defense. Like our first witness, this is a man who has served our government long and well, for which we all appreciate and thank him, and has had very important experience at senior levels of government. We do appreciate your willingness to appear before the Commission. Your prepared statement will be in the record in full. So if you would like to proceed, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. What I'd like to do, if it's suitable, sir, is to summarize the basic points of my testimony and then answer the many questions that I'm sure you will have. We owe it to the families of the victims of the 9/11 attacks and to all U.S. citizens to assure that the United States intelligence is in the best possible position to protect Americans from future terrorist attacks. In my judgment, sir, is that better, sir? In my judgment, the U.S. intelligence capabilities are inadequate to meet today's terrorist threats and other security threats that our nation faces. This is not surprising. Intelligence responsibilities and authorities were really established 50 years ago to meet Cold War challenges. They were based on distinctions which no longer hold today, that there was a bright line between peacetime and wartime, that there was a bright line between foreign and domestic threats, and that there was a bright line between national security and law enforcement. In my judgment, significant change is required. And in my comments, I would like to describe to you the realignments that, in my judgment, are needed to accomplish this improvement in U.S. intelligence. My principle in my underlying proposed realignment is that I believe that the balance between national security and law enforcement in counterterrorism efforts, that the priority must be given to national security and to defense of the American people. As you understand, at present, the Director of Central Intelligence has little executive authority over the intelligence programs for which he or she is responsible. Even though he is the senior intelligence official responsible for national security, he has executive authority only over the Central Intelligence Agency and over none of the other many other intelligence agencies that are in our government, including in the Defense Department and the FBI. By executive authority, I mean the combination of two kinds of functions. One is the budget and resource allocation function, and the second thing is the responsibility for day-to-day management of operations. The Director of Central Intelligence is responsible for the Central Intelligence Agency and therefore for foreign intelligence collection, but domestic intelligence collection activities are in the FBI, and that separation of foreign and domestic intelligence collection places limits on the effectiveness of our intelligence, which I believe have to be removed in order to better combat terrorist threats. The single most important change that I propose for your consideration, Mr. Chairman, is that the Director of Central Intelligence be given executive authority for domestic intelligence collection, where U.S. persons are involved. This would mean transfer of the FBI's Intelligence Division and Counterterrorism Division to the new Domestic Intelligence Service, established as an agency under the Director of Central Intelligence, and that this new Domestic Intelligence Service would report and be responsible to the Director of Central Intelligence, just as the CIA is today. There should be transfer of those individuals, special agents in the FBI who are dedicated to and able to help in this domestic intelligence collection, but the principal function would be to bring together domestic and foreign intelligence collection under the executive authority of the Director of Central Intelligence. The principal advantage of this arrangement would be that it would permit integration of domestic and foreign intelligence efforts to combat terrorism. consider a database put together to look at the movements of suspected foreign terrorists into the United States or dealing with foreign persons abroad. All of this needs to be handled under a single collection and analytic umbrella to provide the information, the intelligence, and the warning for the leadership of this country. I don't believe that this can be adequately pursued in the Federal Bureau of Investigation because their traditional approach, highly successful as it has been, is to build a case for prosecution under the laws, under the rules and the procedures which work for law enforcement. Their view, their tradition, and a strong tradition it is to collect a case, provide the basis for a case suitable for bringing to prosecution in a case of law. The intelligence community, on the other hand, is collect information, give it as wide as possible dissemination with appropriate caveats in order to provide warning of potential attacks or warning of potential actions. The FBI, as a consequence, has limited analytical capability for intelligence collection and, more importantly, analysis. And while I'm sure that there have been improvements in past years, I believe that ultimately the fundamental culture of having it in a law enforcement environment where law enforcement rules hold mean that the intelligence dissemination, collection, and analysis will not be as wide as it should be. There are, of course, disadvantages to the centralization of domestic and foreign intelligence under the Director of Central Intelligence, and most of that has to do with the risk of misuse of intelligence information bearing on Americans. That's a very serious matter. But indeed, I would suggest that that risk exists in all arrangements that are under consideration, including the present one, where the FBI is involved in these activities. And the Department of Justice, very important responsibility, must assure and have the power of oversight to make sure that there is no violation of what are the agreed upon American rights, rights of Americans, during the collection analysis of domestic intelligence. The second most important recommendation that I make is for strengthening our intelligence capability to combat terrorism and other national security threats is to change the balance of authority between the Director of Central Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense. As you know, the Director of Central Intelligence has limited ability to coordinate or plan the resource efforts of the intelligence community. Of the three major national security intelligence programs, the National Foreign Intelligence Program, the Joint Military Intelligence Program, and the Tactical Intelligence and related activities, all of which are, most of which are in the Department of Defense, the Director of Central Intelligence does not have authority over 2 out of 3 of those programs, the so-called JMIP and Tierra program. The Director of Central Intelligence has little ability to influence some of the key intelligence agencies in the Department of Defense, the National Security Agency, the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Reconnaissance Office. I believe that effective intelligence requires an integrated effort of all these programs and all these different agencies. One must establish a metric for performance, a metric for following costs, a schedule for achieving different benchmarks for better intelligence collection and analysis. For example, it is vital to have the strongest link between the National Security Agency and the CIA's Directorate of Operations. That can only be managed more effectively over time if there is integrated resource planning by the Director of Central Intelligence. Therefore, I would propose that the Director of Central Intelligence be given responsibility for resource management, principal responsibility for resource management over all intelligence programs of this country, but specifically of the Department of Defense. I would leave the day-to-day management of the agencies with the Secretary of Defense for very practical reasons. The activities of the National Security Agency, for example, in communication security, the activities of the Defense Intelligence Agency in supporting troops in the field require that the Secretary of Defense have day-to-day management authority. Unlike my proposal for domestic intelligence service, where I would give executive authority to the Director of Central Intelligence. In this case, I believe the day-to-day management responsibility must be with the Secretary of Defense, and resource planning should be in resource allocation with the Director of Central Intelligence, that person being held accountable, and in the end with the Secretary of Defense having to concur in the proposed program. If these different authorities are given, these additional authorities are given to the Director of Central Intelligence, I believe we have to recognize that the responsibilities of that individual are different than the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, and that those two positions should be separated. There should be an individual who functions as a Director of Central Intelligence with responsibility over the new Domestic Intelligence Service, over the CIA and the resource planning for the entire intelligence community. And there should be a Director of the CIA who reports to the DCI, just as a new Director of the Defense Intelligence Service. Clearly, to do this responsibly properly, the Director of Central Intelligence will need a stronger community staff with greater responsibilities to integrate different efforts. I've included in the testimony, and I know it doesn't show up well, a chart that indicates the proposed realignment of responsibilities. And the central features of the chart are the creation of a new domestic intelligence service under the Director of Central Intelligence and the creation of a single integrated resource planning effort for the combined intelligence budgets. Finally, it indicates the responsibility of the intelligence community staff providing needed functional oversight over many parts of the intelligence community activities that are required to strengthen our intelligence capability. I'm just going to briefly mention what these are. They are mentioned in more detail in my testimony. First, this new realignment will strengthen human intelligence collection by integrating various efforts which are taking place today in the DoD, in the FBI, and certainly in the Directorate of Operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. It should, very importantly, improve intelligence analysis by giving analysts access to information from every possible source, especially domestic collection efforts. It will make the Director of Central Intelligence more accountable for performance, because that individual now will have the responsibility for resource management for the entire community, and it will give that individual executive authority over domestic and foreign intelligence collection. There are other accompanying changes which should help make this a more effective arrangement. There are measures which can be done to strengthen covert action, an extremely important feature of our fight against terrorism. The ultimate success is to learn of a serious terrorist threat and to interdict it before it occurs to threaten American people and American lives and property. The new arrangement should also be organized to do better oversight and management of information operations, offensive information operations. I believe the Director of Central Intelligence needs to be given greater authority to coordinate cooperation with other countries. Currently, this is done on an agency-by-agency basis, and we do not have a general approach to it was my experience, to cooperation with all aspects of intelligence with various countries who are extremely important partners to us in the fight against terrorism and other intelligence matters. The new arrangement should help the Director of Central Intelligence plan for and execute a better and more effective science and technology program, bringing online advances in technology which will help collect intelligence, more information for our protection. For example, in the management and exploitation of databases, for example, the detection of biological warfare and chemical warfare agents, for example, in the downstream processing, exploitation, and dissemination of the enormous amount of material which are now collected by our satellites. And finally, I would mention the importance of having rotation of personnel between intelligence agencies, just like was done in Goldwater Nichols here in this building, I guess, to assure that officers in one of the intelligence agencies, sometime in their careers, they gain in seniority, have the experience of working in other intelligence agencies. Let me summarize, sir. Terrorism and national security threats demand greater integration of intelligence collection and analytic activities in this country. The walls that exist between law enforcement and intelligence and the intelligence community must be just done away with. And the intelligence community must have greater ability to manage the resources which are presently in the Department of Defense's budget. I've proposed integration under the Director of Central Intelligence as the best way to achieve and improve intelligence for the security of the U.S. people. There are, of course, other options. Let me mention three. One is do nothing. Work at the margins to improve the existing practice. That's always a prudent thing to do. It's always the easy thing to do. In my judgment, that will not lead to the necessary improvement of intelligence that should be given to the American people. The second is to establish a domestic intelligence service, but to place it in the Department of Homeland Security. This is sort of the MI5 model, where the MI5 model really reports to the Home Office in the United Kingdom. Here, I think that would be moving in exactly the opposite direction. Instead of consolidating the intelligence activities, it would be creating yet a third center. You could give the responsibility to the Secretary of Defense. On the other hand, the Secretary of Defense's primary responsibility is military matters. And as said earlier, that person is very busy indeed as things stand. Or finally, you could give the principal authority to the FBI and the Department of Justice. I believe that there is an essential conflict between law enforcement and national security that makes that a bad idea. I believe that the FBI, for the cultural reasons I mentioned, is unlikely to quickly build up the necessary capability for either collection or analysis. And frankly, I believe the Department of Justice should have a focus on defending and protecting and assuring that U.S. rights are respected, however the balance is struck in these matters. So in my judgment, the best option, and the option that I would urge this commission to consider carefully, is to a centralization of the intelligence activities and responsibilities under the Director of Central Intelligence with the provisos that I have mentioned. Thank you very much for your attention, Mr. Chairman.